Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Money and Stuff. Glad you are joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about the election and markets. So I think the two questions that we get the most are, what happens during election years? Should I be doing something different with my investments? And then number two is, what's going to happen to the market depending on who gets into office? So we're going to cover that today, answer those questions, tell you what we think, tell you what the data shows. I guess let's get into it. I don't really introduce myself. My name is Sam Rodriguez. I'm a certified financial planner. This is Money and Stuff. If you haven't been here before, where my co-host and I, Conor Shepard, we just talk about things that we get questions about. Hey guys, before we get into it, I just wanted to say thank you so much for tuning in. And if you could just please hit that like and subscribe, it would really mean a lot to us. Thanks a lot. I'll let you get back to it. Conor, how's it going, man?
It's going good, Sam. Getting through the week. Things are finally cooling down here in Texas, so I'm in a good mood.
If this is your first time listening, know that Conor's always going to give you a weather update. No personal information, no reason why things are going well. As far as anyone who listens to this podcast is concerned, Conor's mood is completely dependent on the weather.
I'll say this, I can't be the only one, but it is fun to just play amateur weatherman whenever we do a podcast.
You're not letting people know you're a weatherman that only tells people what's happening right now. That's it.
I'm telling them what they can literally look out the window and see for themselves.
See, no, here's what's going to come. Just like, I know you already know this. I'm going to let you know, man. So let's get into it. How do we want to kick this off? You've been talking to a lot of people lately. What are you hearing? What are people asking you right now?
The closer we're getting to the election, the more uncertainty they feel and the more worried they get about, what if the other guy gets into office, and is that going to cause everything to fall apart? I think that's kind of the running theme that we tend to hear around this, 4-year cycle.
Yeah. So that really falls into what's going to happen to markets if one person versus the other gets into office. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's people can hear and understand, oh yeah, election years have more volatility than usual, but it's an emotional or a deeper concern that people start to feel, especially as it gets closer and closer to election time. People just worrying about, the worst case scenarios, the what ifs of, everything goes wrong.
Yeah. So really, we're talking about two separate things there, right? We're talking about volatility during the election year, right? Which is usually the main thing is the run up to the election. And then what happens depending on who gets into office. So, I know that people say, hey, election years are pretty volatile, or things could fall apart during election years. And I'm not going to say that election years are not volatile. But I think we have to define what volatile means, right? Volatile doesn't necessarily mean that the market's for sure going to fall, or the markets tend to fall more in election years. As a matter of fact, if you look historically since 1930, I think we've had 22 elections or election years, and I should say specifically presidential election years. And 20 out of those 22 were positive, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it was a smooth ride. I think as we get closer to the election, things maybe tend to bounce around a little more, but not in a way that would make you think that the market's going to fall apart, right? Or that necessarily is going to mean a bad year, right? And I think the thing to look at out of those 22 years is, were we in a recession, or what were conditions that caused the market to be down at that time? And when you look at it, sometimes when we have election years, we happen to be in a recession, and it happens to be a negative year. But it really didn't have anything to do with the election. It had more to do with economic conditions at the time. And so I do think that over all other things, the economy is really what's going to matter, right? Economic conditions are really what's going to matter. I think as we get closer and closer to the election, there may be some like emotional run up, right? I think everybody's scared that if the other side gets into office, that everything's going to fall apart, right? But both sides feel that way. And so we can feel the ups and downs and things bouncing around a little more. But, the statistics show, even if that does happen, from the moment that we know who the president is going to be to the end of the year is usually pretty positive, right, for the rest of the year.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think there's two factors to think about in this. Number one, the fact that a lot of the time you have a huge proportion of voters that are voting with the economy being the number one issue for them, the number one concern. And so going into the election year, as things ramp up, you have a large portion of people already concerned about the economy being the biggest factor in their decision. And combine that with just the acceleration of political ads, the campaigning, the news, everything going on that really heightens that concern about what's going to happen to the economy, what's it going to mean. And it's easy for people to get kind of stuck in a vacuum of thinking with it, where they're viewing this year or the election year as, an isolated, pendant event. And the reality is, like you pointed out, those external factors from the prior years played as big, if not a bigger role in what it is going to mean for the economy long term. And so even though it can feel like this, more immediate concern, this sometimes existential dread of what's it going to mean for the economy, the reality is, there isn't nearly as much that influences how the economy behaves in that single election year compared to prior years that they've had.
Are you saying there's a lot of political blustering? There's a lot of hot air about things that they can't actually control?
I think so. I mean, again, it's, and this goes for every side of the political spectrum. The reality is, if you can get voters worked up over a single issue and you can position yourself as the better choice to solve that issue or the better choice to address that issue, it makes it easier, or I don't know if easier is the word, but it makes it simpler to address those concerns and kind of steer the ship of what people want to see.
Yeah, you need a boogeyman, right? You need something that you can say, I'm the only one keeping the boogeyman at bay. And this person wants to just let the boogeyman out, wants to come out from under your bed, out from the closet, whatever it is, right? But unless I get into office, things are going to be terrible. And I think you're right to your point earlier, right? Like, one of the main issues for people is my household economy. How do I feel? How secure do I feel? And I think the political candidates, knowing that that's the case, will use that, right? They'll campaign on that. And unfortunately, usually they campaign on fear versus what they actually could do. Right. And I think that's by design, right? I mean, we know it. People move more by fear than they do optimism, right? You tell someone, look, if we do these things, everything's going to be great. People get excited by that, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to take action. But if you tell them everything would be great if we do this, also, if you don't do this, everything's going to get really, really bad. Suddenly, you want things not to be bad more than you want things to be good. So if
Yeah.
they can stoke the bad, they can get people out there to vote for them, right? So there's a lot of fear stoked leading up to the election, which can lead to some volatility, can lead to some selling, right? Um, but ultimately, historically, election years tend to be fine, right? Even though there's a little bit more volatility, maybe in the few weeks ahead of the election, if you looked at election years versus any other year and you didn't know that it was an election year, there'd be nothing to indicate that it was any different than any other year in the markets.
Yeah, and I think that's, a key factor, a key difference is, when we're looking at it again in a vacuum, right? You tend to have more of the fluctuation during that election year, right? The ups and downs seem to be a little more drastic. They seem to be happening more often. But outside of that election year and over the whole, election years really don't ever come out as being significantly different than any other non-election year. But that increased volatility and fluctuation during that time, it plays into what we're talking about. It plays into making it easier to, play into people's concern, right? And I think what you said earlier is fantastic, right? It's easier to paint hell in somebody's eyes than it is to paint heaven. And so
Right.
that, I think, when you can take a step back and look at it from a macro perspective, you actually realize, oh, the election year actually really doesn't turn out to be any different than a non-election year in terms of how the market ends up.
Doesn't really turn out to be anything, right? It's like I said, any other year. So let's talk about this, right? So the next thing we get questions about is what's going to happen if so and so wins. And I think this is a year where we're getting more of that because we don't have an incumbent candidate,
Mhm.
right? I think in normal election years where there's an incumbent, there's the idea of we'll continue to feel this, or what's going to happen if this guy gets in. But we have two candidates, right? And it's a little unusual because one has been vice president, so they sort of have been there, and one has already been president.
This is an especially unique election year because, to your point, right, we don't have a directly incumbent president in the race, right? We've got the VP of the current president running, and then you have Trump, who was president in the past, but wasn't in office over the past 4 years. And so this is
Yeah.
a much more unique dynamic in the election ecosphere.
Neither incumbent, but both with some level of experience inside of the White House, right? Like that's very, very unusual because no one can attack experience. So we've got to attack I don't know, like the boogeyman that we were talking about, right? So you know what I'll say is I always just look at the data, right? And I'm not going to get into the data of if it's better under Republicans or Democrats. I don't want to step into those waters. Maybe if we get a lot of requests of that, I'll talk about it. But if I do, just know it's just data, right? But I think what people need to remember is the things that the candidates are talking about now, the policies that they're saying they're going to put out, or the policies they're saying they're going to put forth, or the things that they're saying that they want to do. It's just talk at this point. And I'm not saying that they don't follow through. I mean, they don't, but that's not even the point. The real thing is they can't do it on their own, right? Like they have to get Congress to agree, right? They don't just say like, hey, this is my idea and we're going to do it. There's a long process. And then both sides debate it. And then it usually comes out to be something that wasn't quite what they were thinking it was going to be anyway, if it ever even happens. And I think people overstate the president's ability to impact markets and the economy. Do they have something to do with it? Yeah, but the economy is huge, right? And there's so many different factors that go into what's happening in the economy and what's happening in the markets. And one of the things that I think, man, I'm trying to figure out how to say this without talking about one of the candidates directly. Something that I think people need to understand is that the economy and the stock market are two completely separate things. And one can be doing well while the other is not. Can the markets be affected by the economy? Absolutely. Can markets do poorly when the economy is doing well? Yes. Can markets do well while the economy is not doing so great? Yes. Can they both be bad at the same time? Yes. Can they both be good at the same time? Yes. They are two separate things, right? So don't just look at what the stock market did and assume that the economy was good at the time. Also, you can't look at the policies that the president is going to put forth and assume that those economic policies were going to move the needle on the stock market. Ultimately, the market's going to come down to you and I spending money, businesses doing well. And there's too many other things that could happen that would affect markets, right? Things that we don't see coming, right? I mean, we saw that in 2020 when the pandemic hit, well, I'll say if something happens on the other side of the world, if I'm talking about economically and some of the things that happened in 2022 that made it a bad year, I think we got into it at the time, and I don't think we've talked about it in a couple of years, but a lot of our inflation problems is because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So there's things that are just out of our control, out of the president's control, that are going to affect both the economy and the market. Like the economy, again, is too big for one person to have that much of an effect on it.
And, I think you make several really good points. Number one, I think a lot of people tend to tie the stock market directly into being the deciding indicator of the economy. And it can in some ways be that, but it is not the whole piece of the puzzle, right? It's just a portion. And especially when you look at candidates that are running, I think because they kind of become the face of the policy behind them, the party, the other politicians behind them, it's easy to start to assume or get the impression that the president is the end all be all for what direction things go, how things end up, what decisions are made. And to your point, there's so many other factors that play into it, both internal in our country and external, right? Outside events that are happening around the world, changes that are happening, and it's important to keep that in mind. Another thing I think people realize is, when somebody becomes president, that isn't an automatic clean slate. Hey, anything that happens from here on out is only a result of their decisions. Every president coming in after a previous president is going to have residual effects from that previous president's policy, decisions, influence, whatever you want to say. And so even if somebody has great ideas, even if they talk very, very highly of what they're trying to do, there's always the potential that they're either not able to because of the prior administration's decisions, or that they are in a position where they don't have nearly as much ability to influence or control that and create the opportunity that they have campaigned on, right? So all of these factors really play into it being an extremely multifaceted issue. And I think too often it becomes overly simplified in their minds.
Yeah, so many things economically. I hear people say things like, well, if we just did this, this would be the result. That's just common sense. And I gotta say, um, common sense is great for common things, but the economy is not. It is extremely complex, and every move that you make creates a ripple effect. And those ripple effects can really be what makes the difference. I'm trying to think of an example, and I can't. I'm blanking right now. If I think of one later, I'll insert it in right here, but I don't have it.
I mean, just an example that comes to mind is you have Trump's tax cuts that he did back in 2016. And, you know, one of the talking points that I hear is, oh, if Kamala is elected, then she's going to let those roll back and we're going to have higher tax rates. And, the reality is, number one, we don't know for sure what that decision would be, even if she did get elected. But, it's just an example of policies that cross that threshold beyond just the single term or the 4 or 8 year period that a previous president was in office.
Man, I'm very tempted to get into taxes. I'm not going to. And we should talk about that another time. But the fear of what taxes could do to the economy, I'll say this, is overblown. Just go back and look at how the economy did and how the market did during varying periods of our American history. You look back, and I guess I am getting into taxes here, right? But you look back and, even during times where people were getting taxed 50%, we even had a 90% tax bracket at one time. And guess what? The market still went up. Taxes is just one piece, right? It's just one piece of the pie. There's so many other factors at play. Let's end on this. I'm going to talk about, are Republicans or Democrats better for the market? I'm not going to talk about the economy. Again, like you just said, there's so many things that go on to it or that go into it. And sometimes you benefit from the things that the previous administration did, or you have to deal with the things that the previous administration did. So I'm just going to talk about market returns. Democrats, Republicans. But I'm not going to give specific stats because I don't want anybody to jump on me and say that I prefer one or the other. I'm just going to say this. I'm looking at a chart right now. We put this out on all of our social media earlier this week, talking about the market's trend over different administrations. So Republicans represented by red, Democrats represented by blue, and we have every administration on there. What I'm going to tell you is that it didn't matter who was in office. Every administration had a positive market return over their term in office. Now, there was only one where it was negative, and that was during George W. Bush's time in office. He dealt with two very big events that really made that 10-year, I know he was in for 8 years, but there was a 10-year time period where the market was basically sideways. Now, it was very volatile, but it ended up basically flat over a 10-year time period. But he had the September 11th attacks, and we fell into recession during that time period, right? So he had a recession almost as soon as he got into office, it hit. And as we were coming out of that, and as we were recovering from that recession, then the housing crisis started. And we had the worst economic recession we had had since the Great Depression. So not surprising that the market was negative during his term in office. But that is the only time that an administration has had negative market returns, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is the market is apolitical. It does not care who's in office. I feel like I had something stronger to end on with that statement, but I can't think of what it would have been right now.
I think it hits the nail on the head. I mean, at the end of the day, again, politics by nature, it's a dynamic of almost, the other side is going to do something wrong. Our side is the one that's going to fix it. But the reality is, when we're talking about the market and how it's behaving, it doesn't care what party is in office. right? The market is a part of the economy, but it is its own ecosystem of unique behavior, dynamics, and trends that does politics play a role? Sometimes. But overall, especially when we're talking about the data that you just mentioned, really doesn't play as big of a role as I think people think it does.
Yeah. So end result, people, Connor just said it. It doesn't matter as much as you think that it does. It's probably more of a campaign talking point than anything. If you have money that's invested or you're saving money for specific goals like retirement, the important thing is to continue to invest and be diversified and have a portfolio that fits your specific risk tolerance and is in line with your overall goals. That is going to have a bigger impact on your investing success than who's in the White House. All right, guys, I think that's probably it for today. If you stayed this long, really appreciate you listening in. If you enjoyed this, please hit like, please hit subscribe. We would really appreciate it. And as always, if there's anything that you want us to talk about, please feel free to let us know. We could probably ramble on about anything. Really appreciate it, guys. Thanks a lot.